Hello everyone, in this tutorial we will be learning how to make a simple player controller in Unity. We will be using the new Unity input system. So let's begin. As you can see, I have already created a simple scene. In our scene, I have a player game object and a ground game object. In our player game object, I have some sprites, capsule collider 2D, and rigid body 2D component. In our rigid body 2D, I have freeze rotation Z active. In our ground game object, we have a box collider 2D. So before we begin, make sure you have installed the new input system. So go to your package manager, click on Unity Registry, scroll down, and make sure you have installed the input system. Once that's done, right-click on your Assets folder, click on Create, and then select Input Actions. Let's call it Player Actions. Open your Player Actions and click on the plus icon to create our action map. Let's call it Player Input. Then in our actions, let's rename it to move and make sure to change the action type to value and the control type to vector 2. Click on the drop down and we can delete the no binding and then click on the plus icon next to the move and select the add up down left right composite. Click on the 2D vector drop down and in here we can see some action that has no bindings assigned to it. Since we will be making a 2D side-scroller game and not a top-down game, so I will leave the up-down bindings empty. So click on the left path. You can manually select the key you would like to assign, but I'll just type directly from the keyboard. So I'll type A and select A keyboard. And then for our right binding, I'll just type D and select the D keyboard, and then save asset and close. Now we need to make our player script. So right click on the assets, create, and mono behavior script. Let's call it player controller. Open your player controller script. The first thing we need to do is add the namespace of our new input system. So we'll type using Unity engine dot input system. Then below our player controller, we'll type private float move speed. And let's give it a value of 8f. I would also like to see this in our inspector, but since it's private, we can add an attribute to make it visible. So we'll type serialize field. Now we will also like to reference our rigid body, so we'll type rigid body 2D and let's call it RB. And we need another variable for our movement, and so let's call it private float move input. In our start function, let's reference and assign our rigid body. So we'll type RB is equal to, and Visual Studio will automatically give us the code. So we'll press tab key. And now for the player movement, we'll type it in void fixed update. The reason I'm typing the movement function on the fixed update instead of update is because fixed update runs certain amount of times and it is independent of the player's frame rate. We'll type rb.linear velocity equal to new vector 2. So for our x-axis, we'll type move input multiply by move speed, comma, and for our y-axis, we'll just leave it as normal. So we'll type rb.linear velocity y. Now, so what this function does is we are telling our rigid body to move on the x-axis while leaving the y-axis normal. So as we have already assigned the move speed the value of 8, so we need to find out the move input values. For that, we'll type a function. So let's type public void on, move, and you need to type it like this for it to work. Then we'll give it a parameter, input value, and let's call it value. And inside this function, we just type move input is equal to value dot get vector2 dot x. So basically we're saying to get the horizontal key bindings and assign it to our move input. So now if we save and go to Unity, then click on our player game object and make sure you assign the player controller script. Before we click on play, we need to add one more component. And this component is called player input. This component is automatically installed when you install the new input system. In our player input component, for the action section, we'll assign the player actions, and for the default map, we'll choose the player input and make sure the behavior is set as send messages. So Ctrl S to save. We can also see our move speed value, and now we can adjust it directly from the inspector instead of going back to the script again and again. So now let's click on play. And now as you can see, our player moves. So now that our player moves, we need to make a jump function. So click on the player actions. In our action, create on the plus icon and rename this to jump. Click on the drop down of the jump action, click on the no binding, click on path and type space and select the space keyboard. Click on save asset and close. Now open the player controller script again, and in here we'll type our jump force. So again, we'll type the serialized field so it's visible in our inspector, private float jump force. Now let's give it a value of 10 f. Below our void on move function, we'll type public void on jump. Make sure to type it as it is. For the parameter, we'll type input value and let's call it value. And inside this function, we'll say if value dot is pressed, which means if we press the spacebar, then rb dot linear velocity is equal to new vector 2. This time for our x-axis, we'll leave it as normal, so we'll type rb dot linear velocity x, comma, and for the and for the y-axis, we'll just type jump force. Now, if we save and head back to Unity, if you press spacebar, we can jump. So the only issue right now is that if I press spacebar while mid-air, the player can jump again. So let's try to fix that. Open your player controller script, type again serialize attribute, then we'll type private bool is grounded. And for this function, we'll be using the built-in Unity function called onCollisionEnter. So we will type void onCollision and we will select the onCollisionEnter 2D. So what these two functions does is that we are telling our player if we collide with a game object that has a tag of ground, make the isGrounded boolean true. If the player exits from a game object that has a tag of ground, then make the isGrounded false. So now we need to assign the isGrounded in our jump function. So after if value is pressed, we'll type AND operator is grounded. So now we say if we press the space bar and if the player is grounded, then we can jump. So Control S to save and head back to Unity. Before we can click on play, make sure to assign the ground tag. So we click on our ground game object, then click on tag and select add tag, and then click on the plus icon and type ground. Make sure to type it the same way as you typed in the script and save. Go back to your ground game object and assign the ground tag. Control S to save. So now if you click on play, we should be able to jump only if the player is touching the ground. We can move around and jump, and if I try to jump mid-air, it no longer jumps. In fact, you can see it in the inspector. Whenever the player is colliding with the ground, the S grounded is true, but if we jump, it's false. The next function I would like to add is to make the player look towards where it's moving. For example, if we are moving to the right direction, the player is looking towards the right. But if we move to the left direction, the player is not rotating. So let's fix that. Open your player controller script, and inside our void update function, we'll type if move input is greater than 0, then so here we will type transform dot local scale is equal to new vector 3, and we'll type 1 for our x value, 1 for our y value, and 1 for our z value, and then else if our move input is less than 0, then transform dot local scale is equal to new vector 3. In here, we'll just type -1 for our x value while keeping the rest the same. And that's it. Now if you save and go back to Unity, click on play. So now if you're moving left, the player will look towards left, and if you're moving right, it will look towards right. You can even see it in our scale that when you're moving right, it will be 1 on the x value, but if you're moving left, it will be -1 on the x value. So the last thing I want to do for the player controller script, and this is optional, is I want to make it more polished. So if you go to our player controller script, we can add a header attribute. So let's type header, and let's call it movement, and we'll copy this header and paste it above jump force. Well, let's rename it to jump, and Control S. Basically what it does, it just makes it more organized in our inspector. So if we go back to our Unity, we can see that our variables are separated by the header. So that's all for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.